Shabbos Daf Mem Aleph contains two Mishnayos. From the beginning of the Daf until the first Mishnah is a continuation of a series of stories of Talmidim, students who followed their Rebbeim into the bathhouse, or other situations in which they bathed and they learned several halachas from them. We will have two more stories and lessons that can be learned from it. Then we'll have a Mishnah which discusses two or three types of devices that contained heat-producing elements within the device and also held water, and what those halachas will be. That's a very short Mishnah with a very short Gemara that follows, and then we'll get to another short Mishnah which discusses the halachos of pouring a large amount of water into a smaller amount of hot water, such that the cold water that's being poured into the hot water can't be heated up to the point which is forbidden, and how it is possible to do that in a permitted fashion, and a couple of other issues that pertain to that. And it'll also take us into the beginning of discussion of Klisheni, which will take us for another daf or two. So let us begin. We had, at the end of daf mem, we had a number of discussions about lessons to be learned from Talmidim who followed their Rebbeim into the bathhouse. The last one was Rabbi Zera, who was observing Rabbi Avo, and the next one is again Rabbi Zera observing Rabbi Avo, but this time he bathed in the river. And Rabbi Zera says, I observed that Rabbi Avo held his hand over his private area for modesty, in order to cover it from view, but I'm not sure if his hand touched his private area or not. So the Gemara right away says, how is it possible to even think that Rabbi Avo touched his hand to his private area? There are two problems with that. The first problem is that we know that it's forbidden to touch the private area because it brings to seminal emissions and improper thoughts. Like we learned, halacha and a brisa, Rabbi Eliezer says it's forbidden for a person to hold his male member while he urinates, because that is what the people on the generation of the flood, that's what they did, and that's why they had a flood. We don't want to end up with a flood. So how could Rabbi Zera even think that Rabbi Avo would do something like that? So the Gemara says, Abaye answers, no, that's not a problem, because in a situation of fear, a person doesn't have thoughts which lead to desire, and since it was fear here, you don't have to worry about it. And whenever you're standing in the river, there's a fear of drowning, so there was no such problem there, and therefore Rabbi Zera entertained the possibility that maybe Rabbi Avo did touch. Now, the Gemara compares this to the halacha of a barrel of wine, which is in a city when a troop of marauding soldiers passes through the city. So a sealed barrel of wine is never a problem. You don't have to worry that the soldiers opened the barrel, touched the wine, made a guy nesach, and resealed it. That they wouldn't do. However, an open barrel of wine could be they did touch, but that's only if there's no war. If they're just rampaging through the city and having fun, then you do have to be afraid that they touched the barrel of wine, and that barrel of wine would then have the halacha of yayin nesach. However, if there's a war and they're in wartime, so they're in a state of fear. In a state of fear, a person does not indulge himself with guilty little pleasures, and therefore you don't need to be concerned, and that same thing would apply to Rabbi Avo in the river. Now, the second problem would be as follows. We know that it's forbidden for a person to cover his private area because it shows that he's embarrassed at having a bris milah, the bris of Avram Avinu. So how could we even say that Rabbi Avo covered his area? So Gemara says, not necessarily. The only time there's a problem is when the person is on his way down into the river. That way he's facing away from the people who are on the bank, and there's no reason for him to cover it because of tznius, because of modesty, and therefore if he nevertheless insists on covering it, that seems to indicate that he's embarrassed at the fact that he has a bris. However, on the way out of the river, he's facing the people. It makes sense for him to cover it because of modesty. It would not indicate any sort of embarrassment, and that's what Rabbi Abo held, and that's why he was covering it. Now the Gemara says that there's actually machlokus about this, and we'll see three opinions. Rava, whenever he went into or out of the river, he hunched because he wanted to cover the area because of tznius, and obviously he didn't want to put his hand there because he was afraid that he would touch by accident, and that would be the wrong thing to do. Rabbi Zera stood straight and tall, either way, on the way in and out of the river, but he was more concerned that he should not appear embarrassed of the bris, and the Talmidim of Rav Ashi, they had this split halacha that we saw earlier. On the way into the river, they hunched. On the way out of the river, they hunched because they were facing the Rabim, and on the way into the river, they stood straight because there was no embarrassment there. And this is the end of this discussion. Now the Gemara starts another discussion of a Talmud who learned something from the bathhouse. The Gemara says again, it's Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera was avoiding Rabbi Yehuda because Rabbi Zera was a Talmud of Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Zera wanted to move to Eretz Yisrael, and he knew that Rabbi Yehuda held that it was forbidden because Rabbi Yehuda said, the pasuk says in Yirmiyahu, Bavel Yuvo V'Shama Yu, they should go to Babylonia, and that's where they should stay. So Rabbi Yehuda held that refers to Klal Yisrael, and therefore they have no right to leave. They have no right to go back to Eretz Yisrael. However, Rabbi Zera felt that was referring to the Kelim level for the Beis HaMikdash, and therefore it is permitted for a person to move to Eretz Yisrael. So he was hiding from Rabbi Yehuda. Nevertheless, he wanted to learn one final thing from him before he moved away, and therefore he decided to follow him to the bathhouse and see what he could learn there. And he heard Rabbi Yehuda saying the following thing. In Lashon HaKodesh, he told his attendants, bring me shampoo, bring me a comb. And then he switched to Aramaic, and he said to them, open your mouths so that the hot air of the bathhouse can enter, and then drink some of the water of the bath. So Rabbi Zera said, if I would have only learned these things, that would have been enough of reasons for me to come and learn all these very important things. So the Gemara says, well, what exactly did he learn? So the Gemara says, well, the fact that he spoke in Lashon HaKodesh, in Hebrew, about mundane manners teaches that it's permitted to speak in Lashon HaKodesh even about mundane manners in the bathhouse. The fact that he said, open your mouth and let the hot air goes, and that fits with what Shmuel said, because Shmuel said that when you inhale hot air, that makes the body sweat, heat in, pushes heat out, and sweating is healthy. But what's so great about drinking the water of the bath? So the Gemara quotes a Brisa, which has a number of bits of advice about health, and one of them is this, that you should drink hot water when you take a bath. And the Brisa says as follows, somebody who eats without drinking, his eating is like blood, and it's the beginning of stomach pains. Somebody who eats and doesn't walk 4 hours between then and the time he goes to sleep, his food will rot inside him. That's the beginning of bad breath. Somebody who needs to use the bathroom but eats anyway without relieving himself first, that's like an oven that you light a fire in without first clearing out the ash from the previous fire, and that's the beginning of body odor. Somebody who washes himself in hot water and doesn't drink any of it, and this is our case, this is what we need, that's like an oven that you lit a fire on the outside of it and not on the inside. Because the hot water is on the outside, the hot water is not on the inside of the body, and again, it doesn't do much good. So that's what Rabbi Yehuda was referring to. Now the rest of the Brisa says, somebody who washes himself in hot water and doesn't rinse himself afterwards in cold water, it's like steel that you put in a furnace to shape, but you do not rinse it off in cold water afterwards, and therefore it never has a full hardening. It does not get the benefit and the advantage of the heat. And then the last thing is somebody who washes himself and doesn't anoint himself afterwards with some type of oil to hold in the moisture. That's like somebody who pours water on the outside of a barrel, not on the inside. It just runs right off. So too, this guy took a bath and he didn't keep the moisture in, it just runs right off. Okay, this takes us to the next Mishnah. The Mishnah discusses 2 types of devices which had heat bearing compartments. They had a place where you could put coals in, and they also held water. And the Mishnah is discussing where you had coals in the coal compartment, you took the coals out, but there's still heat. And then you have water in the water compartment. So are you allowed to drink from it or not? And it depends what type of device you have. The Mishnah talks about 2 devices. There's mulyar, that as long as the coals are out of it, it's permitted to drink from because there's not that much heat generated by the walls of the kli itself once the coals are removed. But there's a different one called an antichi, that even if the coals are removed, it still generates a lot of heat, and you're not allowed to drink from it because it's heating the water that's inside. Now what are these 2 things? Mulyar, which you said is permitted. So the Gemara explains that's a device which has a large compartment for water and has kind of like a layer over the side where you could put coals in, and it doesn't get very hot once the coals are out. Therefore it is mutter. Now what's an antichi? So there's a machlokes here. So everybody agrees that the halacha of antichi applies to a stove that just has a water compartment in the side. That's very hot. It's mostly coals. It's very hot. And therefore that counts as an antichi for sure, and it's forbidden to drink water that was left in there even after the coals are removed. Now there's a middle device though between a mulyar and this stove with the water compartment, there's a middle device. It's not clear if it's an antichi and it's forbidden or if it's a muyar and it's permitted. And that is a kettle with a false bottom inside that you put coals under the false bottom. So it's got the floor of the kli holds coals, and then there's another covering on top of that, and then you put the water in on top of that. So if there's no coals in it, because it's made out of copper, so it's not clear if the heat is retained for a long time. It's a machlokes, and Rabbi Nachman bar Yitzchak says it's forbidden, it's an antichi, and Rabbah says no, Rabbah says that is permitted. This takes us to the next Mishnah. And this Mishnah discusses pouring a large amount of cold water into a small amount of hot water or into a hot pot, a hot kettle, in such a situation that the cold water can never reach the temperature which is considered cooking, which, like we said earlier, is yad soletis, where the hand recoils, which is between 110 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. So the Mishnah talks about a kettle which is cleared, a kettle which is removed, and it says you can't put hot water in it to the heat that it can become hot, but you could put hot water in it to the extent that it could just become warm. It's unclear what this Mishnah means, and there'll be a dispute amongst the Amoraim how to simply interpret, how to translate the words here. Then the Mishnah adds at the end, into a cup, you are allowed to put cold water in a situation in which it will become warm, but not hot. So now, in order to understand this, we have to think about the issues over here. So, the two potential problems with putting cold water into a hot kettle are as follows. First of all, the cold water that you add in will heat up, and it may cook. Second problem you have is that when you have a hot metal device and you put cold water into it, it hardens the metal, and that would be an iser of tziruf. It is forbidden to do that. That is strengthening and completing the workmanship of the kettle itself. These are two problems we have to deal with. But the first thing you have to figure out is, what is the Mishnah talking about? The Mishnah says you're allowed to put water in so that it becomes warm, but not so that it becomes hot. What does that mean? So the Gemara has a basic dispute between Rav Ada bar Masna and Abaye as to just how you translate the phrase. The Mishnah said a kettle which was cleared. What does that mean, a kettle which was cleared? Rav Ada bar Masna understands that means that it was taken, that the water was taken out of the kettle. It was cleared, meaning the water was cleared out of it. Now it's empty. So Rav Ada bar Masna says you're allowed to put a large amount of water into it because the water can't get so hot because you have a lot at once. But you shouldn't put a little amount in because that water will become hot and it'll become too hot. Now, what about the problem of hardening the kli? So this problem certainly applies because the kli is empty. Rav Ada bar Masna says that this must be the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, who holds that it's not a problem if you do a malacha which you did not intend to do. This person is not intending to harden the kli. It's called einay miskavein, and it's not a problem. It's not usher. Now, Abaye says, okay, I hear that. The only problem with it is that that's not how you translate the words of the Mishnah. The Mishnah, when it said that the kettle is cleared, didn't mean the water is cleared out of it. It meant it is removed. It is cleared. It meant that it's cleared off the fire. So the kettle is taken off the fire, but it still has hot water in it. And therefore, Abaye says, the Mishnah says, you're allowed to put in a lot of water so that the water can't become too hot. You shouldn't put in a little bit of water because the water will become hot. And you don't have to worry about hardening the thing because it's not going to become hard because there's water in it already. There's still hot water inside it. If, however, you were to put it in an empty kettle, it would harden it and it would be usher, and this Mishnah goes according to Rabbi Huda's opinion. Now the Gemara quotes another machlokes Amoraim about this Mishnah. Rav says the Mishnah is only saying that you're allowed to warm the water. It's not saying that you're allowed to make the kettle hard. And Shmuel says, no, you're allowed to make the kettle hard. So the Gemara right away says, what do you mean? You're allowed to purposely harden the kettle? That can't be. So the Gemara says, that's not what they meant. They meant, how much water are you allowed to put in? Rav says, you're allowed to put in so much water as to make the water warm, but you shouldn't put in too much water and fill it all the way up to the rim, because if you fill it all the way up to the rim, it'll definitely make the kettle hard, and you shouldn't, because the top part of the kettle is the part that becomes softened by the fire. It's where there's no water in the kettle. The part of the kettle that has no water in it, that's what becomes softened when it's on the fire. So you shouldn't fill it all the way up. Shmuel says, no, you're allowed to fill it all the way up to the rim, and that's not a problem. You don't have to worry about hardening. The Gemara, and this is the end of the daf, the Gemara on the daf tomorrow, question, how could Shmuel say that you don't have to worry about hardening? Does that seem to indicate that Shmuel holds like Rabbi Shimon?